Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China has set an economic growth target of around 5% this year, according to its latest government work report. Meanwhile, the country has also vowed to enhance frontier technology research, further expand domestic demand, and open its market further to foreign investors. Just to name a few, what is China's economic outlook in 2024? What challenges does it face? And what reforms does it need to ensure sustainable growth in the long term? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today is Jin Keyu, Associate Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Jin.
Thank you for having me.
People are focusing on the around 5% of economic growth target for 2024 and other important numbers, for example, 3% budget deficit, etc. So far, based on your observation, what's your impression? What impressed you the most of the two sessions?
What impresses me the most is how proactive the Chinese government is in trying to think about plans not only for the short term, but also for the long term, and what kind of policies are suitable for China today, which is very different from the post-financial recession crisis of 2009. First of all, China currently has a demand deficit, and to create more employment is critically important to have people feel more secure about their job prospects and their wage growth. And I think this is one really important factor that will really stimulate consumption. The second is, China is obviously much larger than it was a little more than 10 years ago. So the kind of policies that would be required and potentially the multipliers behind the policies are smaller than it was before. So you need a bigger stimulus package to meet the challenges in the short term. But also, I think the government is really actively thinking about what are the right policies? What are the policies that will not only just work for the short term, but will ensure that China is still on a sustainable growth path, not invoking too much financial instability or risks, part of the lessons drawn from the last round of stimulus, and also thinking about potentially not really about the quantity of growth, but the quality of growth and the sustainability of growth and high quality growth. So it's a very complex problem really to solve currently for the economic objectives, and the government is trying to balance many things at the same time. I do believe that there's a substantial room for stimulus in my view, because I think that's really what it takes to solve the current demand issue that I see in the short run. But of course, it's also important to think about what the implications are for China in the longer term.
All right, one of the most important or most watched figure is the economic growth target for 2024. That is around 5%, the same as in last year. Of course, it would be probably more challenging to achieve the same rate of growth in 2024 because the base is much higher. So some say this is ambitious. Some say this is reasonable. This is achievable. And what do you make of that?
It certainly is an ambitious target, 5%, in the sense that the majority of the world is growing at a substantially slower rate. I do believe that there's some continued room for recovery from households. And there's also a lot of proactive government policy, including fiscal policy. Trillions of RMB can be spent on new infrastructure investment. And of course, infrastructure investment and all the government spending can do much to create these much needed jobs and potentially help sustain a feasible path of wage growth, which is really what China needs to see right now on the consumption side, on the demand side. And I also would say that it depends on how this 5% is also achieved. It was achieved in a very different way, one can argue, in 2009 with really lots of stimulus, lots of government spending on property, on infrastructure, traditional infrastructure. And I think the government is precisely trying to caution itself away from the past approach for reasons of trying to preserve financial stability. I don't think that, whether it's 5% or a little bit below 5% is really essential here. I think it's really about, kind of meeting the short-term challenges so that we can ensure that China is back on returns to a path of normalcy, back to on a path of reaching China's potential for the longer term.
Some analysts are saying that there's a lack of, say, massive stimulus package, and then meaning that's not enough to support such a high growth rate of around 5%. Do you agree?
I'm rather in agreement with this kind of view, just because not only first we have to look at what happened in history. Now, Japan, before the significant economic stagnation that lasted for a decade, they also had the problem of insufficient monetary stimulus and stimulus package in general, because they were also attributing to what was happening in Japan as structural long-term issues rather than a simple demand deficit issue, and they turn out to be wrong about that. So not sufficient stimulus in the near term could have longer term consequences. This is what worries me the most, and I do believe that if we have a situation of a Keynesian demand problem, then a stimulus package, but the one that is effective, one that has big multipliers, one that's going to reach the entire economy rather than just directed towards certain parts of the economy, could be very, very useful. We shouldn't simply dismiss these stimulus packages for consumption and for households as something that's not useful or not viable, because there are lots of ways to design it better to make it really become a boosting force for the economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of this demand or say lack of confidence in consumption or the weak consumption situation there. There's a piece on the FT by Martin Wolf saying that excessive savings in China is a long-term danger for the country's economic growth. Tell us, is it the case? Is it too high in terms of savings rate for the Chinese economy?
Saving has its inherent advantages. A country that can rely on domestic saving to undertake important investment and to not rely on foreign capital has been able to help countries avoid some of the other developing countries' experience of sovereign debt crises and the vulnerability to foreign capital flows. But I do believe that China's at a point where savings is potentially too high, especially because it's even higher, the savings rate for households are even higher than pre-pandemic levels, and that signals precautionary saving. So what I'm most concerned about is this too much saving, deflationary, not enough demand kind of vicious circle. Now, the Western economies also had, for a period of time, what we believe to be a secular stagnation in the sense of a big demand deficit, and we're seeing lots of similar signs. So savings should come down, but it's also it's difficult to induce people to save less. I think the major factor behind the saving is greater uncertainty potentially, but also real wage growth. Has it been growing really steadily? Is it sustainably going to be growing? Or a lot of people have concerns about their future employment, and future wage growth, I think, is driving the precautionary saving aspect.
On the other side of the story, of course, is people's concern of whether there's a deflation in China. Some say the deflation probably has been there for a long time. From 2008, last global financial crisis. They say this is the longest deflationary run China has experienced since that time. So, is there deflation in China? How big a problem is that, if so?
We might be seeing some overall deflationary trend in the last few years is really the possibility of too much capacity relative to capacity absorption. There's a huge amount of competition in China. China's economy has traditionally been focused on production and and companies. And indeed, China has really succeeded in becoming world leaders in many sectors. But because of the competition, because of the model in China, there's also a lot of capacity, more than can be domestically consumed.
When we mention overcapacity, we often talk about it in a negative sense. Of course, redundancy is one issue. The other issue is like people would say, oh, China is to solve its overcapacity by exporting its cheaper products to the world markets there. But also you mentioned about this is a result of fierce competition. Can we blame the competition for producing overcapacity in specific products? I mean, competition is good, right?
Competition is very important because that's what keeps companies on their toes and keeps companies from keeps them innovating rather than comfortably in a very comfortable position and stagnating. So healthy competition, of course, is very good. We do want to think about the entire structure of the Chinese economy. Again, I think coming back to our initial question, the lack of demand, domestic demand, is also contributing to some of the overcapacity issues. If the Chinese people just simply spend more and then buy more things, then this also reduces some of those issues. It's not just coming from the supply side on its own. And I do believe that China is also shifting away from a model of too much government subsidies and influence towards a much more market-driven model. I think the initial boost to have Chinese companies start in a new sector where there's no real international, new international competitors, there's a role for the state, but afterwards the state should step back, and I think it is stepping back in the sense that markets are determining who's going to be the ultimate winner. But again, I still believe that there's a huge amount of debate behind industrial policies. We're looking at the US, which is going to embark on a huge industrial policy new era. Then we're looking at China, which needs to pull back a little bit of the industrial policies and make it more market driven. And there's a midpoint in between the two that I think makes the most sense.
European Union or the US, they have expressed the concern of the import or possible import of the Chinese EVs, solar products, etc., the renewables there. And the European Union is doing investigation into the Chinese side, whether there is a government subsidy for the development of EVs. What's your opinion on that? What do you make of that? Whether there's all the Chinese success in EVs or solar products is due to the government subsidies?
No, I don't believe it's due to government subsidies. I believe that Chinese companies are very competitive for a variety of reasons. One of the most important reasons is that China has a massive market and it has a very feedback system from customers back to the companies to the products. And there's a lot of competition that drives innovation. Government subsidies is not something that should be avoided entirely. If you look at the US model, it's looking more and more like China's model with the CHIPS Act, Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and Jake Sullivan's recent speech on how to restore American competitiveness on unapologetically using state forces. That sounds pretty much like they are validating China's approach when it comes to emerging strategic industries. I think when it comes to these kind of competitive forces, it's not that the subsidies are not allowed, it's that are they actively distorting the domestic market compared to the international market that we need to be more cautious about. But again, if you look at the solar industry, the fact that solar prices are now maybe 5% of what it was, 5 to 10% what it was even 10, 15 years ago. Well, that's also really thanks to China because China really led the boom. Is it a good thing for the world? I think it is. Who's subsidizing it in the end? It's Chinese consumers. So I'm not sure why people are so angry for Chinese consumers subsidizing everybody's energy cost around the world if they are the first ones to really give it a full push. But again, I do believe this is very tricky for that provokes international controversy. But again, this is not just really what concerns China. What the US is lecturing on China, Europeans are also lecturing on the United States. And we are generally seeing a picture of greater protectionism in many, many economies, hiding behind some veil of international competitiveness or national security. And that is really a dangerous trend, that protectionist inclination that is going to reverse globalization.
Well, another front is we do see, based on the government worker report or other related documents, China is to increase investment in science and technology, in innovation by 10%, much higher rate increase than last year, is about more than 2%. So I think this is in line with the Chinese talk of high quality productive forces. You want to see the economy growth driven by innovation in science and technology rather than relying on investment and export. Well, maybe that's the response to the U.S. Let's say tech war on China, or export ban or investment restrictions in high-tech sector.
I think a lot of these policies will backfire, to be honest. The export restrictions coming from the US will accelerate China's achievement in catching up and overtaking and potentially even leapfrogging some of the frontier technologies. We've seen that also throughout history. Whenever there's too much protectionism, to a lot of export restrictions, then the country subject to these restrictions find ways to obtain these new technologies, because they will mobilize resources, they will find other ways to acquire the technology. Whatever the means, you're simply going to get an acceleration. A lot of these Chinese companies were very happily importing American chips, but now they feel that it's an existential threat. So all the demand for these semiconductors have now shifted back to domestic companies, and hence it's raised their profitability, their ability to do more innovation by investing in much more research and development. You're also mobilizing lots of players to come together to tackle the very challenging issues in technology. So you definitely see an acceleration that I don't think is the intention of the US. It's actually by opening up these channels that you actually slow down your competitor, because they always choose the better international products. So I think that, and the second point is also that lots of these technology restrictions are very leaky. You can't really perfectly monitor them, control them. They're simply being rerouted, just as we've seen through trade, rerouted through other countries, just taking a longer time to get to where it finally needs to get to. And this is a very costly process. So you're increasing the cost of innovation, you're increasing the cost of trade, and that adds to inflationary pressure for the world.
Mm-hmm. But of course, it can. The U.S. tech containment certainly is itself is a challenge to the Chinese tech progress, the economic development. And related to that, I would also want to have your opinion about this TikTok issue. The heated discussion in the U.S. Right now, they are going to impose basically a forced takeover of TikTok, to force TikTok to separate from the parent company, ByteDance. This raises a lot of questions, of course, and it's almost unheard of, basically nationalization of foreign assets inside the United States. I wonder, how, as an economist, how do you see that?
As an economist, it is very startling and surprising that the leader of the free world and of free markets can undertake such an action to private companies, basically, and also companies that are facing huge swaths of consumers. I think it's really very difficult to argue in what sense this is strict national security issues of the highest order. I think lots of Americans will also disagree. I think lots of Americans would not want to see a TikTok ban or drastic changes. And many of them who really believe in efficient free markets and the role and less about the role of the state would also find these actions quite antithetical to the American principle. So in that sense, it is very surprising. I think that lots of governments around the world, unfortunately, for their own political motives, for populism, whether it's driven by populism or other things, are hiding behind some veil of national security and undertaking really plain old protectionism that we've seen over and again that has really led to economies doing much worse. So I don't think this is a good symbolic move that a message that U.S. wants to send to the world by undertaking such an action.
Well, despite the tensions with the U.S., China seems to be determined to open further to the outside world. For example, China is to lift completely the restrictions on the manufacturing sector, improving market access to the telecom and the medical service sector, etc. At the same time, it's giving visa-free treatment to more European countries, Asian countries. How will this help, to ensure or to probably help China to continue to be one of the, let's say, destinations for foreign investment?
These are very important signals to send to the world that China is open to business and more open than ever. This, I think, is important for foreign investors' confidence to show that we are committed to welcoming foreign involvement in the Chinese economy, not only investment, but also companies, also people, to further the exchange between nations and business people and all kinds of flows, whether it's capital flows or resource flows. And I think that should continue. I think China is already at the stage where Chinese companies themselves are so competitive that they really should not be afraid of more foreign competition. In fact, it would be a fantastic thing to see more foreign direct investment and also flowing back to China, because I think there is really a win-win situation here. China has an enormous market, many consumers, from which foreign companies will benefit. China will benefit from the know-how, the technological spillovers, diffusion from these companies, and everybody's in it together. And that would also bring about more potential stability because of more economic connections and networks. And this also sends a very different signal compared to many other countries that are now turning inward. China is doing the opposite. And I think even these visa-free arrangements, despite the fact that they might be small in comparison to some of these big policy changes, they are very, very important as a national signal that China can unilaterally open up more to foreigners, even if it's not, the visa issues are not completely bilateral. And foreign investment will continue to be important, because if China wants to achieve the strategic objective of technological innovation, foreign investment will still be very crucial.
Well, if you focus on that's the negative side or problems of the Chinese economy, I mean, people tend to have a pessimistic sentiment or view of the Chinese economy. I mean, this is not the first time Chinese economy has, beat the expectations of many analysts. Do you think China is going to do it again in 2024?
China hasn't really had many recessions to speak of, if any, measured by official data. And recessions are kind of the natural feature of these market-driven economies. And sometimes recessions also drive out the least productive firms, which releases resources for new entrants and better firms. So it's not always bad to have these business cycles, or it's not completely avoidable. The question really is this a cyclical thing or is this a structural thing? And I personally believe that what we're seeing in the economy today is primarily a cyclical thing. Confidence somewhat related to scarring effects of pandemic, and also investment drops overall from the real estate. These are cyclical aspects of the economy that really doesn't have that much to do with China getting older or productivity losses, which I don't think is really the problem here. I think, yes, there are structural issues. For instance, if you think about the things that China can do, including reforming the hukou system, allowing more labor flows across regions, offering more social security and protection to a wider group of people. I think these are all things that can be improved upon, and I do think that China has a great deal of long-term potential to reach. So I think people are confounding the longer term with the shorter term issues, and my view is to solve the short-term issue, China can possibly then beat the expectations or the pessimistic outlook of the West.
Well, you recently published a book called The New China Playbook. I understand it is, the title is in contrast to the idea of old China Playbook. So what's the key message you want to convey?
China has a new plan, a new era to strive for technological success and innovation and to really dominate emerging sectors. Now, China had significant backwardness, as in all other developing countries, in many of these traditional high-tech sectors, including traditional combustion engine vehicles and semiconductors and so forth. And China has a new playbook for the newly emerging ones, including renewables, AI, quantum, new general purpose technologies that will shape the future. But China also has a very unique model to undertake that program. At the same time, we also have to be honest about potential costs, because look, there are costs behind every model, and cost comes back to our question of capacity, too much competition potentially, and also redundancy. But is it in the end worth it? Does it justify the cost, the benefits? This is something we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's a newly, very untested model because, if we look at industrial policies of the past, the ones that Japan and Korea pursued, it was a lot about catching up to some Western level of standard. Now it's trying to about just leapfrogging and using Chinese national resources, but also this unique combination of private and public partnerships is something that China intends to do. But I hesitate to say that I know what the conclusion is. It is both potentially risky and potentially highly rewarding at the same time.
Right, a lot to explore. With that, we come to the end for today's discussion. Many thanks to our guest, Professor Jin. You can also follow us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Jin Keyu. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.